Greetings comic lovers and welcome back to Casually Comics, the channel where we chat all things comics, from reviews of comics new and old to history to anecdotes to really wherever our whims take us. And today it's whims, Whim City, that turned into a rant and it got very, very interesting. I wasn't even sure if I was gonna go with it, but then I posted the question on the community tab and you guys were like, I need to see it, tell me. So I'm gonna tell you. So I read a lot of comics, and if you've been here for a while, you know that I love the behind the scenes machinations that can end up making some rather interesting things play out on the panels. So today I want to tell you a tale about a bizarre throwaway panel, actually whole page, that ballooned into a fandom firestorm, started a bit of a war off between two authors, and is still highly contested to this day. Although I'm sure some people don't even know that it happened, and maybe that's better, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. We're also gonna examine whether it was something worthy of getting upset about or not in the first place, although of course that is entirely subjective. I'm Sasha, and come ponder with me, fall down the rabbit hole. Subscribe on your way down. Also, this rant ended up being a strangely passionate defense of threesomes, of all things. So yes, stay tuned and figure out how that happened. We're gonna talk about Green Lantern, in this case Hal Jordan's threesome, rated T for teen. A threesome that never happened? Now this line comes from a DC limited series from 2009 written by James Robinson with art by Mauro Cassioli. It has a dark, gritty tone and also was not one of the more well-received comics out there because of a lot of the things that it did to canon at the time. It was spinning out of events dealing with Grant Morrison's Final Crisis. But here's what you need to know. This is Cry for Justice, a very polarizing comic, especially as many feel that some of the things that happened inside of it were just for shock value. Some would agree that some of the more egregious things that occurred were the destruction of Star City and, of course, the killing of Leanne Harper. That being Roy Harper, aka Arsenal, aka Speedy, aka Red Arrow's daughter. Dead. Just cuz. Bye bye Dad Roy, hello to backwards hat Roy, or actually forwards hat. Either way, he's got a hat, and a hat's better than a kid, right? I'm not salty at all. I'm fine. That was not against hats. Hats are amazing and fantastic. So a lot of things happen in this comic, but what we're looking for happens at the beginning of issue 2. After dramatically quitting the Justice League because they're not being proactive enough, yes, it's one of those plots, Green Arrow and Green Lantern are chilling on a rooftop in Gotham, and they're just talking. And then all of a sudden, Hal has a confession to make. I have a confession to make. If it involves you, the Huntress, Lady Blackhawk, and a bottle of grappa, Dina already told me. And all I have to say, sir, is, well played. If Ollie's gonna act like a frat boy, that's the type of voice he's gonna get. So there. Tubular. Shots, 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 shots. No, it's about, wait, you heard about that? Everybody heard about it, from Man-Bat to Metamorpho, and Rex Mason was quite the Lothario before he turned all weird looking, so for him to be impressed took some doing. I'd rather be known for the planes I flew. Wow, okay, Hal. Remember me, because I flew a plane. 3 things to start with. 1, Hal. I will always know you as the man who knocked himself out on his own bathroom floor slipping on a bar of soap, and also the man who knocked himself out flying into a yellow sign. 2, I never knew that Black Canary was such a terrible gossip. Also that she had poor judgment to tell Ollie, who is also now a terrible gossip. Can you see a pattern here? There's some OOC-ness. That means out of characterness. I'm gonna lay the groundwork for that now because it's gonna be relevant in a bit. 3, if Rex truly was such a Lothario as is being claimed, then why is he so impressed by something as vanilla as a threesome? I have questions about his Lothario status. Maybe he needs to give back his player card. 3 whole people. Oh my god. So that was the line. The infamous Hal Jordan had a threesome with Huntress and Lady Blackhawk line. It would not be well received for several reasons. 1, it just comes completely out of nowhere. And it's not set up in any way, and then it never matters or comes back later on. It's just a non sequitur. Hey, I have something to tell you. Oh, hi Mark, how's your sex life? That's essentially what we're dealing with here. It's also something that you have to think about when it comes to page space. When you have limited page space because your series has a set number of issues, you have to think about what you're going to do with them. And Robinson thought that this was so great, he dedicated a whole page to it. So if ever you're reading this and you're like, oh, I wish we could have talked about something else a bit more, remember, this took a whole page. Then you had the defenders of the characters, but you would find that it would mostly be for the ladies. The fact that Hal and Ollie are also completely out of character was rarely brought up at all. The point was made that why would these two women sleep with Hal Jordan? They would never. And some pointed out that in the Birds of Prey comic series, Huntress and Lady Blackhawk didn't get along very well, so they just couldn't see it happening. Then you had those who felt that the very fact that this could have potentially happened or been hinted at was degrading to the woman. And there are a couple of angles here, so let's talk about them. Although, before we do, through all of this, we must note that there is a little undercurrent, an element of prudishness that's gonna run through a bunch of these arguments and color some of them, and you'll see it. When it happens, I'll point it out. Some people just have a problem with this as it's a threesome, and the idea that it's deviant and in some way hence unheroic, so not something for heroes to engage in, which has the unintended consequence of shaming women who have threesomes, but ironically not men, implying that it's not proper behavior for them, hence condescending to the very people they are supposedly defending. But that happens a lot when you're up on a soapbox or pedestal. It's hard to see up there, all the little people down below. And this was a complaint that came from everywhere. Basically, if you had a blog and you talked about stuff like this would come up. I have the receipts. I'm gonna read them for you later. The other angle was that this page was yet another example of women in comics being used as props. Why did this happen? They weren't even here. They had no agency, and yet this was now going to be canon. For no reason. And what important canon it would not be, because no one cared. I mean, now no one cares, because it's years later and it's over. Now, here's where things would get intense. Birds of Prey was about to be written by Gail Simone, again, who had already written a well-received run. She was a then still up-and-coming but well-respected comic book writer who also had deep roots in fandom itself, specifically Tumblr. This is from back in the halcyon days of Tumblr, where you would find creators who were working in media actually also on Tumblr. You still do a little bit, but way less, because the interactions have become much more fraught. And these days, well, Tumblr is a very different place since the whole not safe for work purge ban thing. Neil Gaiman's still on there. He's fun. Gail Simone is the originator of the term and blog Women in Refrigerators, so some in the fandom felt she was kind of the female character champion. And she did make a point of trying to write her comics a little differently, try to stay away from some of those tropes that she wasn't particularly fond of. And so she was actually issued a continuity challenge in regard to this page by the blog Stars and Garters. They said that she could not allow this continuity to stand, that it was offensive to these characters, but again, only the Huntress and Lady Blackhawk. Hal and Ollie, it's fine. You can write them however you want, even if it's out of character. They can be jerks and it's fine. I'm not salty. I have, of course, the receipts from this blog and call out. As a longtime fan of the Birds, particularly your tenure on the book, your being Gail Simone, I can only say that I was rather annoyed that James Robinson pissed away years of your hard work developing Huntress and Lady Blackhawk, all for the sake of the cheap throwaway gag I just showed. This cannot be allowed to stand. See, you see here what I'm talking about, that light threesome shaming that's going on? Because what they're saying is that the threesome undoes all of the character development. Because that's the problem here for this person, not the fact that the characters don't get along or any of the other continuity problems. The threesome is even more important than the fact that it's a throwaway gag and just a not well thought out page or panel. Also, just throwing it out there because it needs to be said, people who don't like each other have sex all the time. So it's not really the best narrative argument, because you could write something like that if you really tried. Not that anybody's trying here, but it's just not a counter argument. Like, they hate each other. Well, then it's just hate sex. So this continuity challenge takes place in 2010, and this comic started being released in 2009, so the feelings were strong and they lingered.
You need to undo this threesome. I don't care that Green Arrow killed a man. I don't care the city was destroyed. I don't care that an elementary school kid died. This threesome is what cannot stand.
Why would Hal Jordan do this? Get these girls away from Hal. A lot of the anger came from fans who were invested in Birds of Prey heavily because they felt that it had been a game changer of a comic, a step forward for women in comics, because there are some who feel that comics is not a safe space for women. Again, the history of women in comics is very nuanced and more complicated than is oftentimes presented, which is just props, everything bad, eye candy. There's a lot more happening there, but that requires a very long discussion and diving into it, and that's hard to do, and you definitely can't do it in, say, just one blog post or one video or one anything. And so it's much simpler to be reductionist and reduce it down, which is what a lot of people end up doing. So they have very narrow focuses or narrow arguments that can sometimes ignore some of the bigger, all-encompassing factors that can also play a part and can sometimes shift some of the situations that occur. But for many, this was a very visceral thing, and so the reactions match accordingly. It's an attack on what they felt was an improvement on a landscape. I have more quotes. Then there's the actual three-way itself. Huntress and Lady Blackhawk were birds together, and that book was partially notable because for all of Gail Simone's stellar run, none of the all-female cast had any serious relationships, besides the editorially mandated Green Arrow Black Canary thing. And Black Canary left the book before that got serious. It was a book not about women like Catwoman and Talia fighting over Batman, but about women who were friends, teammates, and not each other's competition. Because women never compete amongst themselves for other things, I guess. But going on, this throwaway line of dialogue adds nothing to the story except making Hal seem like he uses alcohol to get laid. It also paints Blackhawk and Huntress in a very negative light. They never had serious romantic relations with anyone during a lengthy run of a team comic, but a bottle of grappa gets them naked together? Yeah. They go from being professional teammates and friends to some fantasy groupies. Nice fanfic, Robinson. With one line, you did a good job of tearing down years of progressive writing by Simone. I felt it needed to be read that passionately because that was the emotion I got from it when I read it, so I read it accordingly. That I feel that's the tone. Anger. You'll note that there are some actually very fascinating things about this quote, and if you didn't, I'm gonna underline them for you. Ollie is the person who starts all of this, and yet consistently you will find that Hal is the person who ends up being blamed and also painted as this monster of a man. Why would Hal Jordan do this is the sentiment that somehow becomes echoed throughout the fandom. Also note that nowhere in this is the threesome described, because again, it's just a throwaway line. But the author jumps to some very negative conclusions about Hal. This author at CBR automatically jumped to Hal as a predator who uses alcohol. Like, it's so inconceivable that they would have wanted to be with him or just be hanging out and having drinks with him. Like, it could just have been a hangout. Why did it have to get dark? We don't even know how many people were there. Were they in a group? What was going on? No one knows. A bunch of people went this way. Like, oh my God, Hal's one of those guys who gets chicks drunk to sleep with him. 1 + 1 = 35? It just says there's a bottle. This is like a Mad Lib where somebody fills in the word with their own word and then gets annoyed by what the sentence says. This is one of those gaps that's being filled in by your own mind, your own biases, and your own life experience, which is fine and natural, but it needs to be acknowledged that that's what's happening. Just as my more optimistic, surprisingly optimistic because I am a cynic, that's where my mindset puts it. Why would that be the assumption? This always perplexed me. It still perplexes me, you can probably tell. I feel like I'm in that Community episode, like, man is good. This is the baseline of humankind being decent. Just a bottle and the three of them. How do you know what they talked about? Maybe it's a kink. They could have discussed it. There were so many ways this could have gone. I'm sorry, let me get into the proper mindset. Why would Hal Jordan do this? Also, Gail Simone's run was well written, independent of anything that happened in Robinson's story. Also, completely independent of the lack of relationships. Now that can be a very positive thing for certain fans, but a lack of relationships doesn't make a female character stronger or weaker. The writing does that, and the writing here is solid, and that's what's shining through. And finally, lastly, sometimes people just have sex. It happens. Life. Robinson's page is unnecessary and unthought out. But the whole thing is that I don't like this and I would never imagine them doing this is not necessarily a counter argument in and of itself. The idea of it not adhering to canon or the relationship set up definitely is, but the idea of it being inconceivable is not, because you can always work with things and tweak them to get them where you want. But again, that didn't happen because this is the throwaway page, and that's the problem. Again, you will also see the word fanfic being used as an insult or to degrade. That often happens with this term. If the writing or something occurring is not what a particular fan wants, they will often describe it as fanficky as a way to dismiss it, because the perception of fanfiction is that it is lesser than, beneath, low effort, and that is not the case at all, and it's actually made by some very passionate fans and has a largely female demographic, actually. Just the more you know, and throwing that out there. But the question is, did Gail respond? The answer appears to be yes. There would be another throwaway panel where the women would be discussing Hal about how he got blackout drunk and then thought that they had a threesome. So they let him think it. What? It was met with high praise. Don't think about how Hal was an alcoholic, that's fine. Also don't think about that in the first panel, because that's fine too, apparently. And at this point, that had been retconned out because they punched the wall of existence, so yeah, that's how they got rid of his alcoholism. Superboy Prime Punch! But if this other panel was the case, then that fixes nothing. They used to have two throwaway lines, years apart, where fans may not conceivably have read both comics or issues, won't know what's being talked about, and it's just things out there in the ether. And then the continuity was entirely rebooted, and none of it mattered at all. Depressing, existential, dread. James Robinson and Gail Simone seem not to like each other. By the way, there are lots of mandated tweets about like, they're great and I respect them. It's a fun fact. Actually not a fun fact, just a regular fact. So at the end of the day, this threesome never happened, whether it was through this other second panel or just all of the changes in canon continuity. Never happened. It never was. Hence my title. It's not a lie. Thus, nothing was lost and nothing was gained, except for time. I find this whole thing fascinating because a lot of the outrage plays in the realm of cognitive dissonance. Robinson's panel is bad. Let's call it what it is. It's bad. However, so is the rest of the dialogue in the book. All of them, all of the issues. So for example, on the next page, Hal just comes out and says, "I never liked Bruce," despite us having demonstrable evidence to the contrary. Didn't get along, rubbed each other the wrong way sometimes, especially in the Jeff Johns continuity, but also no. So the series had poor writing and especially poor characterizations. It was one of the things that it was universally panned and critiqued for. People said that every single character was out of character and not being depicted correctly. And yet this page got specific focus and specific attention as a direct insult and attack, but only on the characters who were mentioned that weren't even there, not on the characters who participated in this book and had year-long consequences that came from it. Some felt that no, this has to be an attack on Gale because of the rumors that the two didn't really like each other, but I'm really leaning more towards lazy, poorly thought out joke, especially based on how the rest of the series was written. And some of these complaints, as I mentioned, came after the series had been going on, so you had seen the writing for the later issues at that point. And yet, as often happens, people took it as an attack on them, on Gale, on their favorite characters. And it ballooned, and in the process, barbs went where they didn't need to. Why would Hal Jordan do this? Show up at events with bottles? Monster. Okay. Having a throwaway threesome is not a moment of character assassination. It's a moment of poor writing. It also does not undo the progressiveness of Gail Simone's run. It doesn't weaken her run, for you do not have to take it, especially when no one else is even taking the entire comic at all and saying that the entire thing should be something that really shouldn't have impacted canon. Nothing about this undoes how amazing Gail's run was or what she did with the characters. Characters are always going to be misused or mischaracterized across books because of bad writing, different interpretations, editorial mandate, and a bunch of other reasons. And sometimes it might just be that you don't like what's going on with them, but other people do, although that was not the case here. This is something that occurs largely as a result of having such a long, extended continuity where people are passing the baton one from the other, and also so many things are ongoing, and so who might be a side character in your book is a main character in another book, and it can get pretty tangled. I get the outrage here, I do, but it is disproportionate, but that is tied to some of the other issues and some of the other problems that a fan might have with comics in general, manifesting and playing out and lashing out, especially at Hal Jordan. Some feel this panel exemplifies sexism in comics, saying that the fact that the panel exists shows that institutionalized sexism is still in place, and that's how it got greenlit. Here's the thing, this panel would have been fine if it had mattered in the long run, at all, but it didn't. But at the same time, it must be acknowledged that changes are gonna happen to your faves outside of their books, and you're not gonna like all of them. But counterpoint, authors should be mindful of that when they do it. But counterpoint, maybe your fave isn't as A-list as you think. And when you're a C, or D, or E-list character, you're just lucky to be alive, especially if you're a child. You should just go hide in a bunker somewhere. It's not safe, because as a side character, you end up being a foil. It's part of it. Not everybody can be a main character all the time. Otherwise, your task of writing becomes impossible. You need a focal point. I guess I just wish the scandal had been focused on poor writing, because the thing is, this page is just as pointless, and if you view it as an insult, just as much of an insult if it happened with, say, the male characters. Like, let's paint the scenario again. Hal goes up to the roof, I need to tell you something. And Ollie's like, oh, is it about your threesome with Rex Mason and the Atom? Everybody heard about it. Black Canary, Huntress, Lady Blackhawk, and they're impressed. The Huntress was quite a player back in the day, so it takes a lot to impress her. It's just as bad. It's just as bad if you reverse it. The thing is, if this occurred without women, it wouldn't have the same history. And as a result, some women and men are on more high alert for this type of behavior and more waiting to call it out without waiting to see if it's just an example of poor craftsmanship across the board, which this was. I'm so sorry, but it was. Still, passionate moments like this I can really identify with, because when you love a character or a series or a run, you can end up being very attached to it. But it's always important not let your own self-worth or perception of self get tangled up in these things, because that's when things can get very personal, very dangerous emotionally, for you, for others, for the creators, for anybody. As always, these discussions are fun, but when they descend into personal attacks or character bashing, then it can end up going too far. I'm no great defender of Hal Jordan. I mean, the man once went out with Carol and implied that he was gonna propose, and then asked her to co-sign the lease on his car, and then when she threw a drink in his face and left, he called after her that no, she couldn't leave because she was his ride. The man's a hot mess, a big disaster, but at least blame him for things that he actually did. The other thing here that needs to be acknowledged, and rarely is that everybody's character was assassinated in this panel. And in fact, you could look at it that the Huntress and Lady Blackhawk were the least, because they weren't there, so you can write that off. You could even say like, oh, they entirely made that up, but the people here who are there talking about it, they're the ones who you're just in your face seeing being mischaracterized. I mean, look at Ollie. Since when is Ollie some schoolyard frat boy who kisses and tells? In fact, the only one who seems affronted by what is happening is Hal. But why would Hal Jordan do this? He just wants to be remembered for his plane. Don't weep for me for the woman I banged, but for the planes that I flew. I find exchanges like this so interesting, and I just never seem to feel the same way as everybody else, so I thought I would share. And honestly, when I started writing this isn't where I thought it was going. It was just gonna be like a, this happened, facts, and then all of a sudden I got really impassioned about defending threesomes and Hal Jordan. So, cliff notes, way too late. Threesomes inherently aren't sexist, and having characters just do things allegedly off panel for a throwaway joke is just bad writing, more so than sexism, no matter who is doing it. It just fell under the umbrella of sexism because the characters engaged in it were women, and because of the history. That sometimes has included women as props, but not always, as some seem to think, and also Gail Simone's status and prominence at the time. Honestly, if you want to talk about some of the sexism in this book, you can talk about the drawings. There's Supergirl particularly. There's one panel where all the men are talking and it's just her boobs in the shot. Hold on, I'm sorry, wait, what am I saying? Why would Hal Jordan do this? A lot of it's just cheap exploitative shock value, and the threesome is just an extension of that, and not a deep societal statement. Though some will say that in fact it is a manifestation of the things wrong. We live in a society, I don't know, there are many arguments to be made, but they could just be made more gracefully than they were. Also, Leanne's dead, and I'm sad, and that's apparently canon forever. For me, this panel was just ill-conceived and lazy. Not sexist, but I can see why people would perceive it as such. But a lot more things in life are lazy, rather than bigotry. People are inherently lazy. Man is good, but lazy. And finally, the final point. If something in comics bothers you, which is going to happen, you don't need to, but it's best to sit back and examine why that is. Is this a you thing, or is this a poor writing thing? Is it a combination thing? What is going on? And if you're gonna talk about it, articulate why you don't like it. How much of it is going to stem from you not liking it, and are you twisting the evidence around you to match the fact that you don't like it, or is it actually supporting it? Deep introspective works that I'm thinking about, because I think about this with Rick Grayson all the time. But no, I have receipts for Rick. It's not just that I don't like it. There are many, many other factors. Also, it's always important to remember that it's not just you. There are many other people reading comics, and so there are going to be many different perceptions, and also that canon isn't forever, and that you don't have to accept all canons, and that there are tons of little tiny things that happen in canon that people end up not liking and are just never mentioned again. You'll see something once and everybody was like, that was a terrible idea, and so it just vanishes into the ether, and one doesn't need to cling to the fact that it happened, because then you end up with videos like this. And who wants that? Nobody wants that. What was that? Blah. Wacky, wavy, inflatable arm tube man. I don't know what this video was. Casually Comics, defender of threesomes. Apparently, this went places, but Cry for Justice started it, so I blame Cry for Justice. I did not know I felt this strongly about this until I started scripting it. It was a very bizarre experience. This was cathartic and strange, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And now you know. Huzzah! I'm Sasha, and thanks so much for hanging out for whatever this was. Please tell me sometime that there has been an outrage in comic book culture and you just have not agreed at all, or have taken a completely different viewpoint to it, and it felt like you couldn't say what it was. Also, if you disagree with me entirely, please let me know down below. But again, kindness. It takes a little bit more effort to be kind, but it's worth it in the long run. And never forget, why would Hal Jordan do this? Thanks so much for giving me some of your time. I will see you again soon here on Casually Comics. Bye-bye.